Two Letters from Australia. From Household Words. Conducted by Charles Dickens. A Robin Reads audiobook. Subscribe for more audiobooks. Correspondents, to whom emigration is a subject of vital importance, inasmuch as they appear to be resolved to leave kindred and home for pastures new, have written to us, with a hope that we will continue to give, as we have done hitherto, the dark as well as the light side of the colonial picture. Not a few of the dangers and privations of Australian life we have already laid before them. We are now enabled to furnish some idea of how new localities are colonized by such enterprising pioneers as the author of the letters from which we take the following extracts. It must be remarked that the perils he describes were self-sought, and are by no means incidental to the career of an ordinary emigrant. His adventures occurred beyond the limits of the colony as defined by the British government, which, it would appear, he was in some degree instrumental in extending. We give the round, unvarnished tale precisely as we received it, and as it was communicated by the author to a relative in Cheshire. When we separated from our partner, Mr. W., it became necessary to look for stations outside the limits of the colony, for the only station we then possessed was much too small for our stock. R. and I first took the stock up to the station on the Murray, and having heard that a fine district of country had just been discovered on the Edward, we followed it down and discovered our present runs, and I must say they are equal, for grazing purposes at least, to anything I have seen in the colony. It was necessary that one of us should remain at our station on the Murray, and R. very kindly gave me the option of either remaining or going down the Edward. I preferred going and forming new stations on the Edward, while he agreed to continue where he was, which indeed he preferred. I therefore lost no time in removing the stock before the winter rains should set in, and the waters rise to an unnatural height, which the rivers down here invariably do at this period of the year, overflowing their banks in places for miles. It was too late, for just as we started it commenced raining, and continued without ceasing for a month. It was with the greatest difficulty we got down, as, from continued exposure to wet, and what with driving the cattle by day and watching them by night, we were, as you may suppose, so completely fagged as to be almost hors de service. But there is an end to everything, in this world at least, and so there was to our journey. It excited me at the time, I well recollect, strange and indescribable sensations as I rode over the runs, exploring the different nooks and crannies, all so lonely and still. With not a sound to be heard, save now and then the wild shriek of the native companion, a large bird, or the howl of the native dog, or the still more thrilling yell of the black native, announcing to others the arrival of white men. We were now about 50 miles from any other white habitation, about 600 from Sydney, and 200 from Melbourne. The country down here is almost a dead level, not a single hill to be seen, unless you choose to honour with the name a few miserable mounds of sand which rise to an elevation of some 20 or 30 feet. The plains are very extensive. There is one which extends from our door right across to the Murrumbidgee, a distance of 65 miles, with scarcely a tree on it. The Murray, of which the Edward is a branch, takes its rise in the Australian Alps, and is supplied by springs and snow from these. Some of the highest mountains of this range retain perpetual snow on their summits, but on the lesser ones it melts about the beginning of spring, causing great floods in the Murray and Edward, and our runs, being particularly low, are flooded from 1 to 3 miles on either side of the river. It is necessary to state this to enable you to understand the secrets I am about to unfold. We had built one hut on the south side, Ecliped Barata, but before we could get one up on the south side, Wirrai, the floods came, and I was obliged to substitute a bark one instead. I divided the cattle into 2 herds, and put a steady stock-keeper along with a hut-keeper in charge of one herd on the Wirrai station, while I, with a hut-keeper and another man, we were only 5 altogether, looked after the other on this side. We were badly supplied with arms and ammunition, and by no means prepared to fight a strong battle should the blacks be inclined for mischief. The natives did not show up at the huts for 2 or 3 weeks after our arrival, but kept reconnoitring at a distance, and we could sometimes see them gliding stealthily among the trees not far off us. By degrees, 2 or 3 of them came up and made friends, and then more and more, until we had seen from 40 to 50 of them, but it was remarkable that only old men, boys, and women showed themselves, and none of the warriors. Although I had heard that kindness was of no avail, I never could be brought to believe it, and determined, therefore, to do all in my power to propitiate them by trifling gifts, kind treatment, and avoiding everything that could hurt their feelings. It was of no use. No kindness, nothing, in fact, will teach them the law of meum and tuum, but the white man's gun and his superior courage. We had been down about 3 months, the waters were at their highest, and our huts on both sides of the river were surrounded by water, through which we had to wade every morning to look after the cattle. I was obliged to put the huts within hearing of gunshot, on account of mutual protection, for what, after all, are 2 or 3 men alone without a chance of assistance, against a body of 200 or 300 black warriors, painted and armed, as I have seen them, in all the panoply of savage warfare. We had not seen a single black for nearly 6 weeks, for, as I afterwards learned, they had all gone over to a station on the Murray, about 50 miles from us, where they succeeded in driving the whites out after killing 1 man, and from 300 to 400 head of cattle, without the slightest check or resistance, and having brought their work to a conclusion there, and emboldened by the success of their expedition, they now turned their eyes towards us, and, gathering both numbers and courage, came pouring down on our devoted station. We had heard nothing of these depredations then, and were therefore quite unprepared for them. One day about 20 blacks come up to the huts for the purpose, I suppose, of reconnoitring the nakedness of the land, and we killed for them a bullock, thinking thereby to propitiate them. In this, however, I was most woefully mistaken, for before they had half finished it, they went among the cattle on both sides of the river, and by next morning there was not a single head left within 40 miles, with the exception of a few they had killed at either station. The Wirrai stock-keeper went on the tracks of his herd, and I followed those of mine, and by a week's time we had recovered the greatest part of both, but there were spears sticking in the sides of many of them, which wanton piece of cruelty occasioned several deaths in a short time. Not being strong enough to punish the blacks, and unwilling to begin a quarrel which might cause loss of life perhaps on both sides, and still hoping that they would cease their depredations, I contented myself with giving them to understand that, if they attempted in future to touch either man or beast among us, they should be severely punished. They said it was not them, but some wild blacks, an excuse they always make when they steal. In a fortnight afterwards, however, they acted the same play over again, and again we had the same trouble in recovering the cattle. They did not show after this except at a respectable distance, when it would be with a flourish of spears or a wave of their tomahawks, accompanied with gesticulations of anything but a friendly character. Still I did not believe that they would attempt our lives, until I very nearly paid with mine the forfeit of my incredulity. I should mention that the communication with the Wirrai station was, at this time, carried on by means of bark canoes, which we paddled with long poles. The distance by water was about 3 miles, and by land straight across, 1.5 miles. One day I had gone over to Wirrai in a canoe to see how the stockman was getting on, and on my return was humming a tune and thinking of you, dear William, for I was humming your old favourite, "Flow on, thou shining river," when I fancied I heard a slight noise. I stopped and listened, but could hear nothing. I went a little further and heard it again. I stopped again and peered about the bank, when suddenly about 20 blacks sprung up from behind trees and reeds and long grass, only one of whom I had ever seen before. I was about 50 yards from the nearest of them, and just at the entrance of a creek about 10 yards wide, lined on both sides with thick reeds. When they first appeared, they did not show any weapons, and spoke in a friendly strain. Budgery master always gibbet bullock along in Blackfellow. Asked if I wanted any fish. As I had a good double-barrel gun on my knees, I did not so much care about them, but not exactly liking their appearance, I stopped at about 30 yards. The blacks by this time were jabbering to more down the creek, and I could see that the one side was lined with them. Seeing that I would not come any nearer, they suddenly picked up their spears and altered their tone, and began calling all sorts of names, and threatened to break my head with their nella-nellas, clubs. Quick as lightning they shipped their spears, but not quicker than I levelled my gun. The instant they saw which, they have a great respect for powder, they betook themselves behind trees, and, in truth, I thought it best to follow their example, so, keeping the gun to my shoulder the while, I began as well as I could to paddle the canoe with one hand. Perceiving my object, they stood out to thwart it, and I, knowing that if they sent their spears, though none of them should hit me, they must inevitably shiver the canoe to pieces, determined to get on terra firma as quickly as possible, the water being only knee-deep. In stepping out, I unfortunately got into a stump hole, and the next moment was soused over head and ears in water. This was decidedly unpleasant, and for the first time a thrill of fear came over me. However, I jumped up again, and having been very particular in loading my gun, I thought it might still go off. By this time the blacks had gathered in great numbers on the other side of the creek and were pressing on in a body. Seeing this, I now levelled my piece, and took as deliberate an aim as I could at the foremost of them, a huge brute, for whose capture £100 reward had been offered by government for a murder committed by him on the Murrum Bridge. But the gun hung fire, and the ball dropped into the water. Finding that there was no dependence to be placed in the gun, the only course left me was to retreat, and to attempt this I now resolved. Taking courage at this, a number of them jumped into the water, again I faced them, and again they took to trees. Are they not rank cowards? I was beginning to think that my only chance was to take to my legs, which indeed would have been almost certain death, when at this crisis I was, as you may imagine, agreeably surprised by the welcome "Hello!" of the stockman and hut-keeper, who, having heard the report of the gun and the yells of the savages, knew that something was up, and arrived at the nick of time to my rescue. After giving me some dry ammunition, we made a rush after them, but could not overtake the blacklegs, which were now plying at a particularly nimble rate, and which they especially do when getting out of the reach of a gun. This was the first attempt they had made on any of our lives, and their manoeuvres showed that they were under the impression that, if they could do for the master, they might easily finish the men. But I made it a rule that never less than 2 were to go out on foot or in canoes, and with never less than 20 rounds of ball cartridge. We did not see anything of the blacks for a fortnight after this, during which interval, as they afterwards told us, they were preparing for a grand attack on the Wirrai station. About 2 hours before sundown the following day, the stockman went out, as usual, to see that the cattle were safe. The Wirrai hut, I should mention, was at this time on a kind of island about 1.5 miles in diameter, formed by the Wirrai lagoon and a deep creek, so that the cattle were feeding almost within sight of the hut. All was quiet. The cattle did not seem to betray any symptoms of fear, which they generally will do when the blacks are near. He had not returned more than half an hour when we saw the poor beasts come rushing towards the hut, as if for protection, as hard as they could lay legs to the ground. On going among them, we found many with spears sticking in their bodies. We immediately mounted horses, I bareback, as I had left my saddle at Baratta, and galloped as hard as we could in the direction the cattle had come from for about 1 mile, when, not seeing anything, we stopped and listened. There was a small, dense shrub before us, and, as we approached it, the awful yell that greeted our ears I shall not forget in a hurry. You can have no idea of the effect it has on one unaccustomed to the sound, for it is like nothing earthly that I can compare it to, but more like what one might imagine a lot of fiends would set up while performing their jubilee over the soul of some defunct mortal lately arrived at the prison house. We galloped through the shrub. Before us was a space bounded by two creeks, forming at their junction an angle on the plain beyond. Arranged in a semicircle in this space were some 200 warriors, painted and armed, and drawn up in battle array. Between us and them 4 or 5 bullocks were writhing in their death agony, while the other side of the creek, beyond the warriors, was black with old men, women, and children looking on, and yelling at a most fearful rate. We galloped within gunshot, and I then ordered the stockman to fire on them. I had no gun myself, and had enough to do to sit the young spirited horse I was on. But he refused, saying that my horse would be sure to throw me, and that nothing then could save me from certain death. By this time the blacks were trying to surround us, so as to hem us in between themselves and the creek, and cut off our retreat to the hut where we had left the hut-keeper in charge, and we soon found it necessary to put our horses into a gallop, they following at our heels, in order to get there in time enough to prepare for a defence. It was their intention, as they afterwards kindly informed us, to have killed every man jack of us. We had just got everything ready when on they came, yelling like so many fiends. We stood out from the hut, awaiting their onset. Although the odds against us, as regarded numbers, was fearful, I was confident that if we could only make sure of 3 or 4 of the foremost of them, it would go far to intimidate the rest. So, as soon as they came within range of our guns, we gave them 3 rounds, which, however, only wounded one of them. Still, it made the others check their paces and hesitate a while, seeing especially that we were determined to sell our lives dearly at this crisis. They betook themselves behind trees, protected by which they crept nearer and nearer to us, we taking every opportunity of firing, but with small effect. It being now nearly dark, we were obliged to take to the hut and defend ourselves there as best we could. When inside, they threw a great many spears through the tarpaulin, very fortunately with no other effect than that of one of them just grazing my head. This kind of siege was carried on about 4 hours, we firing a shot now and then, when we thought we could perceive the dim outline of one of them gliding through the dark, and they sending an occasional spear and giving a yell. What we most feared was their making an attempt to set the hut on fire, for if successful in this, and the day having been very warm, our tarpaulin would have burned like so much paper, it would have been all up with us. We had almost given up all hopes of life, and a sort of stubborn, dogged desperation seized me such as I never before felt, and such as, I trust, I never may again feel. We were reduced to nearly a dozen rounds of ammunition, which we resolved to save for the rush. About midnight, I was horribly startled by the stock-keeper announcing that on his side of the hut, we each of us guarded one side, he thought he could distinguish a fire-stick at some distance, and, on looking, we could plainly perceive it approaching nearer and nearer, until it came within what we considered safe gunshot, when I told the stockman, who was the best shot, to take good aim. He fired, and the fire-stick dropped on the ground. A good deal of yelling followed, but they did not again venture to show fire. Everything, after an hour, remained quiet. The cattle had long since been rushed off the island, and the blacks, we supposed, had gone to rest, preparatory to an attack at daybreak. Towards dawn, being faint and weak through anxiety and fasting, for we had had nothing for 24 hours, we determined on having some tea, but before it could be got ready we again heard the blacks yelling most furiously. The stockman and hut-keeper thereupon gave it as their opinion that our only hope of escape was in immediately quitting the hut and attempting, if possible, to get across to Baratta. So, instantly decamping, we crossed the lagoon in a canoe, which we then dragged across a few 100 yards of land to the river. This we also quickly crossed. Just as we reached the Baratta bank, we heard a most awful hullabaloo at Wirai, in which noises our friends the blacks were giving vent to their feelings of disgust and disappointment at not finding us at home. Before they could overtake us, we were safe at Baratta. To be continued in our next, as the editors of periodicals often say. In a second letter, the narrative is resumed. I could see plainly depicted in the faces of the 2 men who were in charge of the Baratta station a considerable degree of suspicion as to the extent of our courage in the Wirai affair. They were both plucky men, but their notions underwent a great change the next day. The day we escaped, we heard nothing more of the natives, except now and then their distant yells, so I sent up a man on horseback to the next station for assistance to help us to find and recover the cattle. But the superintendent either would not or could not give us any, although all his servants, to a man, volunteered to go. I was obliged, therefore, to allow my 4 men to proceed alone. I think I mentioned that I had burned my foot very severely, and by this time, from the work I had had to undergo, I was in great agony from it. But I offered the men, if any one of them objected to it, he could remain in the hut, and I would go in his place. They all, however, readily agreed to go, for, in truth, remaining behind was by far the most dangerous post, inasmuch as the blacks, from their numbers, could easily circumvent the men, or keep them at bay, while they attacked the hut, and I could have done little myself in the way of defence with only an old lockless piece, to discharge which it was necessary to use a fire-stick. Before they left, the stockman took me aside and, with much kindness, implored me earnestly, for my own safety, to take a horse and stop out on the plain. He told me at the same time that he did not expect to come back alive. "But," said he, "it does not matter a straw what becomes of us, for not one of us would be missed." This disinterestedness struck me not a little, as showing a high trait of fine feeling, coming as it did from an old convict who had been transported for life, and had once been condemned to be hanged. However, I resolved to take my chance in the hut, and very glad I was that I did so afterwards, as I should have looked very foolish when my men returned, seated on a horse, and ready to make a bolt. I had waited about an hour with my old gun and fire-stick in hand, without hearing a sound to break the horrid stillness which seemed at that particular time to reign paramount around me, when a distant volley of gunshot burst upon my ear, and then a faint volley of yells. In a short time the sounds were repeated, again and again, but nearer and nearer, and more distinct, a shot or two at a time, with horrible yells filling up the interlude, until I could distinguish my men retreating with an immense semicircle of natives trying to encompass them and cut them off from the hut. My men retreated to the water's edge in capital order, and then faced round to the enemy, for it would have been sure death to have attempted to cross in the face of so many of the foe. After a good deal of skirmishing at this point, a very old black took a green bough, and, standing a little out from the rest, made a long harangue to the white men in his own language, which of course was just so much Hebrew to them. But being anxious for a truce, they ceased firing. Another black who could talk a little English now came forward, and after a good deal of jabber, concluded a peace, one condition of which was that they were to give up everything they had taken from the Wirrai hut. Of course we well knew, or at least fully expected, that this treaty was all hollow on their side, and like lovers' vows, made only to be broken. But the truth was, we were glad enough to get a little respite, even though for ever so short a time. After restoring most of the things they had stolen, the blacks drew off in a body to the other side of the river. The stockman informed me that, when they started on their search, they first crossed the river, and then made away over to the Collegian, where they soon espied a few blacks, apparently reconnoitring, who, when they perceived the white men, made signals to other blacks beyond them, and who, in like manner, signalled others still further away. Presently they saw slowly approaching them a dense black body, which the 2 men who had not been at Wirrai the day before took to be the cattle they were in search of, but which the more experienced stockman at once declared to be a vast body of the blacks. The 2 men at first laughed at this idea as a good joke, but were soon confirmed as to its correctness when they changed their tone, and began to think it high time to return. On, however, they came in a dense body, and when nearly within gunshot spread themselves out, or deployed, as our military brother would I suppose call it, and pressing on in a large semicircle, endeavoured so to manoeuvre as to cut off the escape of the retreating army in the direction of the hut as before related. The truce, as we had anticipated, proved a very short one, as you will presently see. The day following the above incidents, I sent the stockman and another to see after the surviving cattle which our black friends informed us had got out of the island and gone across the country to the Murray, which was true. The men had been gone about 3 hours, when about 100 of the warriors came up to the hut, without their spears, but with plenty of tomahawks, pretending to be good friends. I told the 2 men who were working outside to keep a sharp lookout, as I suspected their friendship was not of that description I most coveted or admired, and being myself scarcely able to move, I sat down in a corner of the hut by a table, with a gun close by me, a brace of pistols in my belt, and another on the table. I told the blacks to keep outside the hut, but they, gradually edging their way in, soon nearly filled it, and seeing that there was no chance of keeping them out, except by proceeding to extremities, I contented myself with watching their motions with all the coolness I could command. They began talking very quietly at first, and I noticed the gentleman I mentioned who could talk a little English, edging by little and little towards me, sometimes talking to his companions and sometimes addressing me. I pretended not to notice him particularly, though at the same time, without looking directly at him, I could see his eyes rolling from the direction of mine to the firearms like a revolving lamp. Soon the jabbering became louder and louder. They were talking themselves into a rage, and I thought I could hear the names of some of those who had fallen made use of. All the while the above-mentioned blackfellow was shuffling closer and closer to me, until i' faith I thought it was high time to act my part in the scene, or give up all thoughts of life. With all the calmness I was master of, I took up a pistol from the table, and taking my English friend by the arm, pointed it at his head, and told him to order all his companions to quit the hut. He shook like an aspen leaf, and turned as white as a black well can, and ordered them to go out, which they immediately did without a word. I then led him after them, and bade them leave the place and return to their camp, which they likewise did. I look upon that as about the narrowest escape I ever had, for the blacks have since told me that they were on the point of making a rush upon us, when it was providentially stopped by the timely proceeding mentioned. Had they done so, nothing, of course, could have saved us. Next day 300 or 400 of them passed the hut in dead silence, and not one of them called. They were all fully armed and painted with red ochre, their uniform for war, and I conjectured they were up to some mischief, but what I could not tell. In about a week we again had the pleasure of seeing them coming in great numbers, and camping in an island about a mile off. From certain signs which experience had taught us, we were well assured that they intended making a grand attack upon our hut. I had no one living at Wirai then, and as there were only 4 of us at Barata, viz. H., who had just arrived, myself and 2 men, the 2 who had been sent after the cattle were still away, and wishing to give the blacks a severe lesson, we sent to the next station for as many men as they could spare. The man we sent had only just reached the station when the commissioner of the district chanced also to arrive there. Now, the commissioner in those days was a man of great authority, in fact, altogether more like a little king than any less lordly personage. So, instead of coming down himself with his police to our assistance, he allowed the superintendent to send 6 of his men, while he himself remained where he was, otium cum, for in truth the old fellow, to say nothing of his love of ease, was of old Falstaff's opinion touching the advisable predominance of a certain quality in the exercise of valour. The men arrived in great silence at midnight, and the blacks fortunately knew nothing of their arrival, for if they had they would have deferred their attack until a more seasonable opportunity when we were not so well prepared for their reception. Daylight came, and in the distance we could see their dusky figures crossing the lagoon to one side. They had only 3 canoes, so that it was a considerable time before all were landed. They then gathered together in a clump in dead silence, and held a council of war, thinking themselves unobserved all the time. At sunrise they slowly approached, and only those of us whom they expected to see showed out to them, and without arms. They appeared to have no other arms than their tomahawks, but every man of them was dragging a large jagged spear with their toes through the long grass. When, by the way, one of these spears enters a man's body, it is impossible to get it out again, except by cutting the flesh all round it, or pushing it right through to the other side. As they advanced nearer, they spoke, and continued talking to us all the time in the most friendly strains, until within about 20 yards, when, just as they, at a signal given by one of them, were stooping to pick up their spears to make a rush, the men in the hut let drive through loopholes right among them, and we all made a simultaneous rush, and put them to rout in a manner that would have given the old Duke intense satisfaction had he been looking on. How many fell, I cannot say, as they always try to drag their dead from the field, and all around us, except on the water side, was long grass and reeds. 2 were left dead, and these we buried. To detail all the skirmishes and the Parthian description of fighting with the blacks for the 18 months which ensued would only weary you. Where, little more than 3 years ago, ours was the only station in this direction, being 5 miles beyond any other, there are now stations formed 100 miles below us, and even ladies of grace the river 40 miles down, one of them married to an old schoolfellow of ours, viz. Broom, nephew of Lord Broom. Among other diversions, I have been employing myself in making a flower garden, for independently of my love of flowers, I think their contemplation and engagement in their cultivation has a humanizing, or, if you will, a civilizing effect on the mind, such as I can assure you we require in the bush. Thank you for listening to Robin Reads audiobooks. If you enjoyed this audiobook, please like, subscribe, click the bell notification icon to keep up to date on all the latest uploads, and give a super thanks or become a channel member to support the channel further. These audiobooks will also become available on Spotify, Bandcamp, Audible, and other audiobook platforms.